Welcome to the Institute for the Study of Ancient Text, and in today's manuscript spotlight, we're going to be back in the Judean desert, specifically Qumran. We're going to take a look at 4Q121, another fragment found in the fourth cave, this time of Numbers. A lot of interesting stuff to take a look at here, as well as do some reading, so I hope you enjoy. Let's take a look. And if you recall from the prior video where we looked at the Qumran version of Greek Leviticus, there are about 27 fragments that were found at Qumran, and there are others that were found elsewhere around the Dead Sea that are in Greek, and they cover portions of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the Epistle of Jeremiah, one of the apocryphal books, First Enoch, one of the pseudepigrapha, and some other miscellaneous fragments that are yet unidentified. Today we're going to be back in Cave 4, which was one of the most important caves. A ton of stuff was found there, not only biblical manuscripts, but also some of the sectarian manuscripts and interesting writings, apocalyptic type stuff, and so forth. And we're going to be using images from the Dead Sea Scrolls Digital Library once again. And you can access their website at deadseascrolls.org.il. Fantastic resource, and really appreciate them putting so much out there for us to take a look at. And in particular, we're going to be looking at the scroll known as 4Q121. Last time we looked at 4Q120. This is a fragment of the book of Numbers. And in the Rolf's Honhart numbering, this is manuscript 803. It's dated to roughly 50 BC to 50 AD. This is clearly a Jewish copy in Greek of the book of Numbers. It's very fragmentary, just to portions from really mostly chapters 3 and 4, with a little, and it's not even the entirety of those chapters. And so we're going to take a look at this for this video. Now, one of the first things to point out is that this is not a papyrus. This is an image from the prior video looking at 4Q120. So this was 4Q120 of Leviticus. And you'll recall that this is a papyrus fragment. You'll see the fibers going horizontally, and here some you can see vertically. And so this is made of that material from the Nile River that you can compress into this writing surface. But 4Q121 is actually a parchment. And you can see that it's quite different here. You see there's a crack in it. You can see the texture is just quite different. The ink sits on the surface quite differently as well. It's not terribly well preserved, even though parchment was generally more durable than papyrus. So you'll see it's quite a different look and feel than what we've seen previously. Fortunately, there are infrared images of this particular manuscript, and that makes the ink a bit easier. So we're going to focus in on that version of the image and try to do some reading. I would encourage you to take a pause and see if you can just make out some letters, make out some words here before we get into the transcription, and I'll walk you through what's on this particular fragment. This happens to be from Numbers 4, verse 7, and you can make out probably a few of the letters, but let's get into it and go line by line. Now, what you don't see off the page here is, I've just supplied it for you. I'm using this light blue in the brackets again to indicate what isn't clearly visible in this surviving fragment. So it's K epi tain trapezon tain, and so that's really off screen here, so to speak. And then we have prakamenane, and so you can see this kappa over here on the left. It's not complete, but a pretty easy epsilon, iota, m, another epsilon, n, eta, nu here. So that's pretty clear. So prakamenane. Now you'll see that there is the faint traces of an E here. And then what you don't see, because it extends into that right bit that's quite fragmentary, is epibalusin, epaltane. Then going on to the next line, you don't see the first part of the word, but this is hemation. You can barely make out the last bit of an alpha here. Then you see the T, I, O, N. So hemation, the end of that. And then you start the next word, which happens to be huakinthenon, which may not be a familiar word. I'll get to the translation here in a bit. So you see the start of a upsilon. This part's been washed out. You do see the last little bit of the kappa here. Then you see the I, the N, the theta, the iota, and then it continues. And so you see a little bit there. Then it continues kai dosusin. Ep, and then we pick up with the T and the eta, and then there would be an N here, but it's missing, the altane. Then we see the start of a T, although you'll notice that the T there almost looks like a upsilon, kind of like the one up here, based on the handwriting of the scribe. TA, so that's your article ta. And then we start with another T, again, more washed out stuff. You have a B here, This actually is a lambda, even though because it's running together, it's a lambda iota. It kind of looks like an M, but it's a lambda iota. And this is trublia, as you can see over here on the right. Gaitas thuiskas, and you don't see really any of that. And then chi again. Again, this is reconstructed using the existing Greek that we do know. And we pick up with a omicron, upsilon, lunate sigma. So that's the end of this tus here. And then we have a kappa, upsilon that you can barely see, an alpha, theta, omicron, upsilon, and sigma. So this would be kuathus. And again, we'll come back to what that means in a minute. Probably not a familiar word, of course, very rare. And then we finish the visible portion with a kappa, an alpha here, and a iota. So that's obviously chi. Then again, we run out of letters that we can make sense of. So it's ta spondea, in hois, and then speude is where we pick up. And so you can see the delta here. You see an E, you see a iota. So that's where we're picking up. There is technically the last little bit of an omega. And so that's where we're getting this ode here. That's the end of the verb. Then we have a very clear in. Then we have al tois. So you can probably make that out pretty clearly so long as you remember your lunate sigmas and the formation of this uppercase script. And then following that altois, you have ke hoi artoi. It's off screen. Of course, you can't see it on this fragment. We're having to reconstruct it. Oi dia. Then we start with pont. We have the last little bit of an O and then a lunate sigma. So that's pontas. And then we have ep. You see the EP there. Then alte. And what you'll notice, ep here is taking the dative. Doesn't have to, but in this case, it can take the dative. You'll see a iota. And instead of it being subscripted down here under the eta, it's written adscript. That's going to be the more common way of doing things, certainly in this period, in this majuscule script. So I've written that out over here. And then we have the start of an E, S, O kind of is up there because of the tear in the manuscript, and esontai they will be. So that is hopefully intelligible as you are making your way through it. Of course, if you're rusty on some of your capital letters, it's going to be tricky, but a lot of words there showing up that are familiar. Many of them, of course, have to be reconstructed using help from other editions based on what we think the Greek text says. But we'll get into comparing it here in the very next section. So that is what we can make of this particular fragment of Numbers 4:7. So let's now take a look at the standard text and compare that with the text of 4Q121 and make some observations. So on the left here, you'll see I've drawn the Old Greek from Rolf's Hanhart. And if you are interested in finding out more about Rolf's Hanhart, I've made some separate videos on that. And we'll take a look at it and translate it as we go there on the far right. So to clean things up a bit, kai epitane trapezon, and upon the table, so trapezon is table, but you'll notice that there is that participle that we picked up with on the fragment, prokamenane. It's in attributive position after the tane. And so this would be upon the presentation table or the setting forth table, something like that. And then we have the verb epibalusin. You notice it's a liquid, drops an L in the future, does this kind of fake epsilon contract with that third plural ending. So they will throw upon or place upon. And then we have ep altane, that is upon the table, upon it. A hemation. Now, you might be more familiar with that as a cloak that you would wear on your body, but in this case, it would just be a generic cloth. And it's halaporphuron, which is holy purple, as you can see over here. So a very purple cloth. They'll place that up on the table. And then we have a list of all the stuff they're going to put on the table. So we have the trublia, the thuiskas, the kuathus, and the spondea. So this is going to be the bowls, the censers, that is related to like burning stuff. The cups, the pouring cups. And then we have in hois spinde, that's referring to the worker in the temple, in which he will pour. He's going to pour out drink offerings and so forth. And then we have lastly kai hoi artoi, that is the loaves. And then hoi diapantas, that is again describing, notice you have attributive position after the article, it's describing the loaves of bread. Diapantas means something like every day or daily, or you could say continual. So it's the continual loaves because they're supposed to stay there inside the holy place. Ep altes, upon it, notice it's the genitive ending here, esontai, will be. And so a little description there of what they're putting on that presentation table. Now let's take a look at some of the differences in 4Q121. A lot of it's the same, but I've underlined the bits that are different. So skipping to this purple cloth, in 4Q121, it's the huakinthenon, which is a blue cloth. And then we have, which is why I left it blank on the left-hand side, okay, dosusin epaltane. We have another verb here. This is from didomi. They will put upon it, that is upon the table. That's not in the Old Greek according to Rolfs, but it is in 4Q121. We have basically the same list of the stuff. The verb, though, is a bit different. Instead of spende, it's speode, and then we have a repetition of in altois, so he will pour upon them, that is upon these cups and bowls. And then instead of the genitive with the epi, we have the dative as we saw. That doesn't really impact translation, though. So what do we make of this? This is pretty interesting differences. None of them are major, but let's point out a couple things here. First off, if you look at the Masoretic text, or any of the Hebrew that we do have, best represented in this case by the Masoretic, it isn't actually a purple cloth. It is indeed a blue cloth. And so 4Q121 is closer to that, and so that's significant. Not really sure where the purple would have come from for the Old Greek translator. And then this seemingly redundant, so they will put upon it, that is this dosusin epaltane, which we don't see in the Old Greek, but we do see in the Qumran version. That is verbatim a great rendering of what later becomes the Masoretic text, and they will put upon it, and so forth. So pretty interesting situation where this difference in adjective and this repetition of the verbal phrase here, not really repetition, but this inclusion of a verbal phrase, both of those do match the Masoretic and disagree with the Old Greek per Rolfs. And so a lot of scholars have argued that this particular fragment, and there will be many others that we'll look at in other videos, are early evidence for an effort to revise the Greek translations back closer to a Hebrew text. In fact, I'll have a whole couple of videos, if not more, on what's called the Kaige tradition. That's the label that we typically apply in Septuagint studies for this idea of, and it started apparently quite early, if this is good evidence for it, of revising the Greek translation where it had perhaps gone astray in the opinion of later editors or later retranslators from the Hebrew they had at their disposal to get it closer to the Hebrew text. And so 4Q121 is an interesting possible example. I think there's probably something to that for that early effort to pretty much immediately revise the Septuagint, which is a good point to underline. As I've mentioned in other videos, and Will Ross and I have written about this in multiple places, a lot of scholars, obviously admit this. There isn't really any such thing as a singular Septuagint that you could just, in 100 BC, just go buy somewhere in the Amazon store of Caesarea or something like that. It's a rolling corpus, and immediately was entering this process of revision and change, and 4Q121 is a good example of that impulse to improve the translation. Now, if we move beyond this fragment, just to show you some screenshots of some of the others, this is the other big chunk of this fragment that you can take a look at. Not a lot of words have survived. This is why I haven't gone through it in detail, but there you can take a look at it. A few other smaller fragments here. So you can make out a few words here and there. And the bottom right one I put there, not in the infrared form, just so you can see what we're dealing with a parchment that is heavily decayed and it's broken up. There's no ink that survived, so far as I can tell, on that particular fragment. But just shows you the painstaking care that scholars have put into preserving this. You can even see that it's mounted on this kind of felty paper to hold these pieces together, and so on. So a lot of interesting stuff, very different than a papyrus, even though the net result of very fragmentary bits and pieces is the same. So we can put those back in the inside of Cave 4Q. That's what we're looking at here. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video, just getting familiar with yet another Greek fragment from Qumran. In future videos, we'll move elsewhere. We'll move kind of south of Qumran to some of the other caves and other archaeological locations where other Greek fragments were found, particularly Nahal Hever, the Cave of Horrors. That one's going to have some interesting stuff in it for us to take a look at down the road. But this is enough today. Hope you've enjoyed this tour through the Greek Dead Sea Scrolls, or at least an initial pass at them.